Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it.
The architect of the human being continues to create and keep the human body standing all the time.
And here's where his argument falls apart and where the fallacy becomes clear. The speaker in this video is assuming that order can only be produced by conscious agency.
How can atoms get along with each other and create so many people every day while they have no knowledge, free will, and life?
But this simply isn't the case, and it's certainly not the case when it comes to human biology.
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arms.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here. And before we begin, I wanted to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, Atlas VPN. Did you know that Netflix hides thousands of TV shows and movie titles depending on which country or region you're in? Did you know that your internet service provider is spying on you and they have the ability to look at your internet search history and track your online activity? Did you know that there are digital criminals who dedicate their lives to retrieving your personal data using malicious links and other methods? Well, thankfully, there's a solution to all of these problems, and it's called Atlas VPN. For just $1.83 per month, yes, you heard that right. For just $1.83 per month, you can gain access to the international libraries of Netflix and other streaming websites. For just $1.83 per month, your internet search history and your private data can remain confidential and hidden from your internet service provider, as it should be. And for just $1.83 per month, you can be protected from malicious links and other terrible and awful scams that are perpetrated by the aforementioned digital criminals who dedicate their lives to retrieving your personal data. And the best part? Atlas VPN gives you access to all of this with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you decide that you don't like the product, which is extremely unlikely, it's no problem. Atlas VPN has got your back. And better still, by signing up for Atlas VPN, you also help out my channel. So what are you waiting for? The question isn't, can I afford Atlas VPN at $1.83 per month? The question is, can I afford not to have Atlas VPN? Think of it like a condom for surfing the internet. It's safe, it's cheap, it's effective, and it's a hell of a lot of fun. Atlas VPN, the best VPN deal on the net. Thank you very much for sponsoring this video. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of the most annoying religious people. Up for today is a channel known as Towards Eternity, an incredibly successful channel. This channel is dedicated to Islamic apologetics, which is to say they use the exact same arguments as every other apologist, whether they're Christian, Jewish, or what have you. But yeah, this particular channel is geared towards Islam, and so they allege that there are at least 3 questions that atheists cannot answer. And so I thought it might be fun today for us to go through these questions and see if indeed they are as unanswerable as these Islamic apologists would have us believe. Suffice to say, what you're about to hear is a list of fallacies and assertions and nonsense. But if you're a fan of this channel, you already knew that. So let's not delay any further and dive right in and answer these so-called unanswerable questions. I hope you enjoy it.
Atheism, a view that constantly leads you to a dead end while questioning the universe. While everything we see in the universe is actually evidence for accepting the Creator, atheism ignores them.
What a wonderful way to set up a video by alleging that the people with whom you disagree are simply ignoring the evidence.
Atheism ignores them.
The people with whom you disagree simply have their heads in the sand, collectively speaking. Please notice, dear listener, that that is not how I argue on this channel. I'm firmly convinced that the average Christian or theist, more generally, that you meet, these are people who are genuinely convinced in the existence of a god or gods. I don't ever poison the well, or at least I try not to poison the well. I've made so many videos at this point that there's going to be an example potentially somewhere of me misspeaking or having a bad day and not attributing the principle of charity. That's entirely possible. But again, let me just set the record straight. If I ever have made that mistake, guys, I absolutely attribute the principle of charity and just assume that the person I'm speaking with, unless there are special considerations to the contrary, I just assume that the person I'm dealing with is reasoning honestly and that they have explored the evidence and that they've just honestly come to a separate conclusion to myself. Please notice that this video begins by alleging that atheists are simply ignoring the evidence. We know God is real in some meaningful sense, but we are just ignoring that evidence. This is an absolutely abysmal and toxic way to begin a video, any video for that matter, and I thought it was worth pointing that out here at the start. I mean, they've already poisoned the well. And so that gives you a sense of where we're going here, dear listener. These people are not going to be reasoning honestly, not when they're poisoning the well right from the outset. And just in closing, this idea that everything serves as evidence for the creator.
While everything we see in the universe is actually evidence for accepting the creator.
Well, of course it does if you think the creator created everything. I mean, that's just almost like a tautology. The creator that created everything. I wonder, does everything serve as evidence for the creator that created everything? Of course it does. The problem is you need to demonstrate that the creator exists, for Christ's sake. Anyway, we're not even 30 seconds into this video and I'm having to make interjections that are this long. So buckle up, folks. Let's continue.
Question number 1. Where do these characteristics come from? It's an established rule that one cannot give what one doesn't have to another one. For example, let's say there are only 100 white balls in a glass sphere. What is the chance of a red ball to be chosen from this sphere? Of course it's 0, right? No matter how long you wait, you will not get any because there is no red ball inside the sphere anyway. Keep this example in mind. Let's consider a black pencil. Can you draw a rainbow with this pencil? No, because the pencil is in no color other than black. So naturally, a rainbow cannot be drawn. What I mean is, you cannot give a feature you don't have to someone else. Now, I take a look at the universe and I see that everything is made of atoms. However, although atoms are ignorant, willless, lifeless and blind, deaf and numb creatures having no cognitive senses, when they come together and occur to us as a human being, we see that the man made of them carries all these features. So, the basic question is, how can atoms give these properties to human beings while they lack all of them? As they cannot be the true sources, there must be someone else holding these attributes. Because the atom that cannot see cannot create the seeing eye. The atom that cannot hear cannot make the hearing ear. The atom without life cannot form the human who has life. The human being has a variety of feelings while atoms don't have any. And all of these things are repeatedly happening every day, even every second. So isn't it necessary to accept that they are under the command of a creator who has attributes such as knowledge, will, power, life, sight, hearing, and compassion behind these atoms? As we said, one cannot give what one doesn't have to another one, so there must be a creator.
There's so much wrong here that I'm actually not even sure where to begin. I'm really just flabbergasted. I suppose I'll start by saying that no, it's not an established rule that features cannot emerge where they were not present in the cause.
It's an established rule that one cannot give what one doesn't have to another one.
That is simply not the case. There are so many examples to the contrary. Sure, I agree with you that I'm never going to be able to pick a red ball from a jar that contains only white balls, and I'm never going to be able to draw a rainbow with all of the colours that encompasses using only a black pencil. Absolutely. But these examples don't demonstrate your point. Like I said, there are so many examples to the contrary. Take, for example, cement. What is cement composed of? Cement is composed of cement powder and water, both of which are soft, neither of which are hard, neither of which have the characteristics of concrete. Yet, when we take cement powder and water and put them together and wait a bit, suddenly we produce something which is very solid, something like concrete. So where did the hardness come from? If the hardness was not present in the causes, how could the hardness be present in the consequence? Using this apologist's logic, in order to explain the emergence of the hardness in the resulting concrete from causes that do not themselves possess the characteristic of hardness, we are duty-bound to infer the existence of an invisible other which embodies this characteristic or property. So we must infer the existence of a divine god of concrete in order to explain where the hardness in the concrete comes from, because the hardness isn't present in the constituent parts, and so therefore we must infer the existence of a divine god of concrete. But of course, this is absurd. The concrete is produced by the combination of the water and the cement powder. Now, I'm not a chemist, so I'm not going to be able to explain exactly how that process occurs, but clearly there's a chemical reaction and a process that takes place when you put water with cement powder, and then you get concrete. It's that simple. There's no mystery here. To be fair, some of you may point out that this analogy is flawed, because cement is made using aggregate, which are small pieces of stone which contain that characteristic hardness. I would be quick to point out in response, however, that there are in fact aggregates that come in powder form or sand form, but let's just assume that this objection holds. Let me give you another analogy. Take, for example, a sponge cake with its characteristic sponginess. Where does the sponginess come from? Consider the fact that the ingredients don't contain this property. The eggs, the flour, and so forth aren't spongy. Yet, the resulting cake is spongy. Again, if we're to deploy the logic of this apologist, we are duty-bound to infer an invisible other, which contains the attribute of sponginess, some kind of divine invisible god of sponginess. But again, this is absurd. Clearly, the sponginess can emerge despite the fact that it's not present in the pre-existing ingredients. The sponginess emerges as a consequence of the chemical interaction of the ingredients combined with baking. Again, this idea that the cause of something must contain all of the attributes that are in the consequence is absurd. What he's talking about here is something known as the causal adequacy principle, which was described beautifully in a book that I read, and I'm still reading, by the way. It's called Descartes, and it's written by John Cottingham. And I'm going to quote this book to you right now because John Cottingham does an amazing job of explaining Descartes' causal adequacy principle, but he also does an excellent job of debunking it, far better than I could ever do. So sit tight and have a listen to the amazing thinking and writing of one John Cottingham. And I quote, "There must be at least as much reality in the efficient and total cause as in the effect of that cause. This principle, which may be called the causal adequacy principle, implies that if there is some item X having the property F, then the cause which produced X, whatever it may be, must possess at least as much Fness as is to be found in X itself. Thus, a stone, says Descartes, cannot be produced except by something which contains everything to be found in the stone. Similarly, heat cannot be produced except by something of at least the same order of perfection as heat." In defending his principle, Descartes remarks that it is a version of the fundamental axiom ex nihilo nihil fit, nothing comes from nothing. For if we admit that there is something in the effect that was not previously present in the cause, we shall also have to admit that this something was produced by nothing. So on the surface, this sounds quite reasonable.
What I mean is, you cannot give a feature you don't have to someone else.
I mean, where does the new feature come from? Is this really an example of creatio ex nihilo, something coming from nothing? Or could it be the case that chemical processes can produce new consequences? Is it possible that when we take things and put them together, that new features can be produced? No duh! Suffice to say, as if it weren't already abundantly clear, the causal adequacy principle is wholly inadequate. See what I did there? Huh? See what I did there? You don't just come here for the philosophy, do you? You come here for my astounding and hilarious sense of humor. Obviously, guys, this principle doesn't work. There are too many examples to the contrary. Sure, it's possible to point out examples where it works, such as I can't choose a red ball from a jar of white balls. It would be impossible to have redness come from the whiteness of the collective of those balls, right? That makes perfect sense. But there are also examples to the contrary. Taking this inconsistency into consideration, that is, the inconsistency of the causal adequacy principle, it's premature at best to infer anything about the cause of human life or the cosmos more broadly based on the nature of the cosmos itself or based on the nature of human life itself. In other words, the fact that human beings are conscious doesn't necessarily mean that that which caused human beings was conscious. Just because the universe is complex or ordered or what have you doesn't mean that the cause of the universe is complex or ordered, etc. Suffice to say, it's an inconsistent mechanism for determining the nature of causes, which is why it is unbelievably fallacious and foolhardy to suggest that the cause of humans or that the cause of consciousness must itself be conscious.
There must be someone else holding these attributes.
But don't take my word for it. John Cottingham does a much better job of laying out the criticism of this principle. And I quote, "To say that whatever produces a stone must itself have all the features to be found in the stone seems to imply a kind of heirloom view of causation, that the only way an effect can have come to possess some property is by inheriting it, heirloom fashion, from its causes." But as Descartes' critic Gassendi pointed out, what plausibility the heirloom view possesses seems to depend on a consideration not of efficient causes, but of material causes or ingredients. For example, if we find a bridge which is very strong, then we might argue that the material ingredients which went to make up the bridge, the girders, the rivets, must possess at least as much strength as to be found in the bridge. For it might seem that if the bridge did not get its strength from its causes, it would have got it from nowhere, which is absurd. Even in the favourable case of material causation, however, the heirloom principle seems open to counterexamples. Helium has properties which were not present in the hydrogen from which it was formed by fusion. Or, if an example taken from modern science seems unfair to Descartes, consider the case of a sponge cake. This has many properties, for example, its characteristic sponginess, which were simply not present in any of the material ingredients, the eggs, flour, butter. To invoke the principle nothing comes from nothing here, in order to defend the heirloom doctrine, would seem to be a muddle. Of course, the sponginess does not arise ex nihilo, it emerges from the complex chemical changes produced by the mixing and the baking. But this fact simply does not support the conclusion that the sponginess was somehow present in some form in the materials from which it arose. One may be tempted to say that the sponginess must have been potentially present in the materials, but this seems to defend the causal adequacy principle at the cost of making it trivially true. In any case, Descartes could not concede that the features found in an effect might be present only potentially in its cause, for his argument requires that the cause of my idea of God be something that not merely potentially, but actually possesses all the relevant perfections. The key point here is the causal adequacy principle does not work. It's fallacious in the extreme. So it's absolutely ridiculous to posit that the fact that we're conscious means that whatever produced us was itself conscious. In other words, it's theoretically possible, although I'm not saying this is likely, I have no idea, but it's theoretically possible that unconscious atoms, when combined, can in fact produce consciousness. Just like items that are not solid when put together can produce something solid, or just like items that are not spongy when put together can produce something spongy. And with all that said and acknowledged, let's move on to the next point.
Second question, who is the judge, who is the prisoner? If everyone is a soldier, a commander is required. If everyone is a prisoner, a judge is needed. It's a rule that you cannot be the judge and the prisoner at the same time. What does this mean? You know that a room cannot be dark and light at the same time, or a paper cannot be dry or wet at the same time. These are some examples confirming that one cannot hold two opposite attributes at the same time, because carrying two attributes opposite to each other is a contradiction.
What he's talking about here is the classical laws of logic, and of course I agree with him. He's referring to the law of the excluded middle. Something cannot be and not be at the same time. If I tell you that the answer is correct, that would mean definitionally that the answer is not wrong. Something cannot be both correct and incorrect at the same time. It has to be one or the other. This is a very, very basic and simple law of logic. So thus far, we are agreed. Let's see where he goes with this.
Being a judge and being a prisoner are two opposite states. If you are one of them, it's impossible to be the other. Now, think of a building which is being built with bricks. If you do not accept the architect to build it, it will be a contradiction to accept that bricks are building this on their own. Because in this case, the bricks will be both prisoners and judges of each other at the same time. Since all the bricks have a nature that is the same with each other and have no knowledge and free will, they cannot form a building by coming together and agreeing. Otherwise, it will be a contradiction. Who will give the order? Who will apply the order? A great confusion would show up. They wouldn't be able to establish a system that could stay protected from collapsing at once. So, they are all prisoners, and there must be an architect who has an absolute power on them. The judge is the architect, and the bricks are his prisoners.
And on this point, we are agreed. Bricks do not randomly assemble themselves into buildings. That simply does not happen. He's approaching this from a purely logical perspective. If something requires an external force or will in order to create it, then it stands to reason that that thing cannot simultaneously be the creator of itself. Buildings are assembled through human agency. We have no evidence of bricks assembling themselves in order to become buildings. All of the evidence we have points in the direction that when buildings form, they are formed as a product of the agency of human beings, imposing an order on the bricks and assembling them using cement, using architects, using bricklayers, and all the rest of it. So, yes, we are agreed. Now let's get to the crucial comparison that he's about to erect in relation to the human body.
Likewise, when we examine the human body, we infer that atoms cannot make this system. 350,000 people are born every day. Who is the commander here and who is the applier? If we assume the atoms to be doing this job, which ones among them give orders and which ones follow the orders? How can atoms get along with each other and create so many people every day while they have no knowledge, free will, and life? So, just as bricks cannot make the building, atoms cannot agree to carry out a quite complex job. That is to say, atoms are prisoners and their judge is God, Allah. Just as the same with the architect of the building, the architect of the human being continues to create and keep the human body standing all the time.
And here's where his argument falls apart and where the fallacy becomes clear. The speaker in this video is assuming that order can only be produced by conscious agency.
How can atoms get along with each other and create so many people every day while they have no knowledge, free will, and life?
But this simply isn't the case, and it's certainly not the case when it comes to human biology. Yes, the laws of logic are clear. Something cannot be and not be at the same time. But does that mean that your average atheist or evolutionary biologist believes that the atoms are the assemblers of themselves?
If we assume the atoms to be doing this job, which ones among them give orders and which ones follow the orders?
No, there is something imposing that order externally. It just so happens that the imposer of that order is not a conscious agent. It is evolution and natural selection. I'm going to go ahead and give a recommendation to any theist who might be watching this video right now, but in my opinion, you guys must, and if you don't, it's at your own peril, but you must abandon biological arguments for the existence of God. Any argument that seeks to demonstrate the existence of God using order in biology is foolhardy and ridiculous. It's completely out of date. It's outmoded. Abandon it and move on, and your apologetics will improve as a consequence. You cannot assert that order is produced by conscious agency when we have the embarrassment of evidence that we have in relation to how biology has formed over time and how complex systems can emerge from very simple building blocks with nothing other than evolution and natural selection as its unconscious guide. You see, there is a guide. This trope that theists throw around about evolution. Oh, so you're going to tell me that biology and human life and the human circulatory system just formed from mere chaos, formed from random chance? That's not very believable. And you're right. That wouldn't be very believable. But it didn't form from random chaos. Natural selection is not random. It's very specific. Natural selection selects for that which survives. Not necessarily the survival of the fittest that people often market the idea as, but it's just survival of the good enough. If a creature is good enough at surviving in a given circumstance, it will pass on its genes to the next generation. And in so doing, the DNA will uncoil and recoil to produce offspring, and that process is imperfect, which leads to the emergence of new features, otherwise known as mutations. And if those mutations are beneficial, then that creature will have an even higher likelihood of passing its genes into the next generation. And if those mutations are not beneficial, or if there's a change in circumstance and in the environment which leads to the creature having a less than optimal chance of survival, then it won't pass its genes into the next generation. That's not random. That's a very specific guide. It's just an unconscious guide. It's called natural selection. That process, that principle applied to random mutations over time, explains the entire history of life on this planet. It explains all of the different species. Suffice to say, we have a reasonable and solid evidenced understanding of how the order, as the gentleman in the video may put it, of human biology has been imposed by an unconscious but guided process called natural selection. You don't get to assert any longer that order is equal to or begs for the existence of a conscious creator. That ship has sailed. Theists need to abandon arguments about complexity in relation to biology, because we have a very full and thorough understanding of how very simple building blocks can produce all of the complexities of biological systems that we observe in the world today. It's over, theists, okay? It's over. So I agree with this guy on the laws of logic, 100%. Atoms aren't going to just assemble themselves, and they don't. They act according to genetics. They act according to evolutionary processes. They act according to natural selection. That is what's going on here. Order is not evidence of a conscious designer, and anybody who tells you otherwise is ignorant, or they're lying to you. And I don't know what's worse. Let's move on.
Question number 3. What is the real reason? Imagine that we see a train and a baby is pulling this huge train with a rope in his hand. Nobody would believe this, so they would look for a hidden cause behind it, right? Because there are no attributes such as sufficient power, knowledge and will in a baby. No doubt, another resource is required. In fact, we see gaps between causes and effects in the universe every day. While the causes are so simple, the results are extremely complex. The emergence of huge trees from a tiny seed. The emergence of a magnificent peacock from a simple egg. The emergence of a complex human from some simple water show us some examples of the gap between causes and results. So it's necessary to look for another source behind the view, because atoms lack the required attributes such as knowledge, free will, power and life. So who holds these attributes?
I won't spend long on this final argument because much of it is in fact a re-articulation of the causal adequacy principle once again. Here he's talking about how atoms couldn't possibly produce the results that they produce because the atoms themselves don't contain the features that they are producing.
So it's necessary to look for another source behind the view, because atoms lack the required attributes such as knowledge, free will, power and life. So who holds these attributes?
Again, this is just an assertion. as, to be expected from a theist. And as I've already described, the causal adequacy principle is nonsense anyway. Just because the cause doesn't contain a particular feature doesn't mean that the resulting effect cannot contain that feature. There are many examples to the contrary that I've already discussed, and I won't go over them again here. The train example that he uses is rather bizarre.
Imagine that we see a train, and a baby is pulling this huge train with a rope in his hand. Nobody would believe this, so they would look for a hidden cause behind it, right?
Yes, a baby pulling a train is in fact a mystery that would beg for an explanation beyond the baby itself. Why? Because we know that babies aren't strong enough to pull trains. If we were to observe something like that happening in the real world, we would suffer with complete and utter incredulity, and we would want to know what's really going on. We would want to know what invisible force, or hitherto unseen force, is at play in this scenario, because it's producing an impossibility. The scenario doesn't make sense, and so we would seek for an explanation beyond the explanation that the baby is pulling it. Because all of the evidence that we have of our eyes and our ears demonstrates to us that babies are incapable of carrying out such a feat. And this is precisely why this is a terrible analogy for the examples he gives in the video. He uses the example of an egg producing a peacock.
The emergence of a magnificent peacock from a simple egg.
Or a human egg and sperm meeting to produce a zygote, then a fetus and a baby, and so on and so forth.
The emergence of a complex human from some simple water.
So is the train and baby analogy a good one for these? Absolutely not. Because the thing is, we know how an egg produces a peacock over time. That's fully explicable. We can go through, using his wording, the sequence of events that produces and ultimately gives rise to a peacock. And we can do the exact same thing with human biology. We can study the egg and the sperm meeting. We have photographs of this. It's fully explicable. In other words, there's no mystery that resides at the heart of the examples that he offers in the video. We have a full and thorough understanding of how peacocks can emerge from something as simple as a peacock egg. We have a full and thorough understanding of how something as complex as a human baby can emerge from the very simple beginnings of something like a sperm and an egg. There is no mystery that's equivalent to the baby example that he gives in the analogy. When a baby pulls a train, our eyebrows raise, and we want to know what's going on there, because all of the evidence of our eyes and our ears demonstrates that what's happening is an impossibility. So we want to know more. We want to know what's going on behind the scenes. But that's not the case when it comes to human embryology or the emergence of a peacock from an egg. There is no equivalent mystery.
Doesn't science explain this, you might ask? No, science only explains the detailed sequence of the stages of their emergence. For example, they observe that there are some certain stages extending over 28 days inside the egg. Observing the stages doesn't mean that you solve the system and find the answer. Observing is just seeing sequences. There are still questions in the mind. How can these atoms form a structure like a peacock despite lacking attributes such as knowledge, free will, power, and life? An explanation which is based on temporal sequence of events leaves out these questions with no answers. So, as we said in the beginning, that a baby cannot pull a train. Just like that, another cause appears to our minds behind the scenes due to the gaps between the so-called causes and their effects that we examine in the universe. So everything we see tells about Allah, those who want to find Him.
It seems to me that he is appealing to some kind of an invisible force here. Some invisible hand that must be guiding the process. And if there isn't such an invisible hand, there would be no reason for any of these things to be doing what they're doing.
So, as we said in the beginning, that a baby cannot pull a train. Just like that, another cause appears to our minds behind the scenes due to the gaps between the so-called causes and their effects that we examine in the universe.
But I'm going to quote Pierre-Simon Laplace here and say that, I'm sorry, sir, but it works without that assumption. Why would you assume that there must be a guiding hand? At a very basic level, it would be like me taking a pen right now and dropping it towards the floor. And then, despite having explained how gravity acts upon the pen and going through Newtonian physics and all the rest of it, he would say, oh, but all you've done is explain a sequence.
Doesn't science explain this, you might ask? No, science only explains the detailed sequence of the stages of their emergence.
But again, when we explain the sequence, it works without the assumption of any divine interference. Why would you assert that there must be a God involved here when we have a full explanation of why the pen falls towards the earth as it does? When you say there must be a God involved because otherwise it doesn't make sense to me how it could be happening, all you're doing is articulating your own incredulity.
Another cause appears to our minds behind the scenes.
This is essentially an argument from ignorance. Translated, what the gentleman is saying is, well, I don't get how any of this could work if there wasn't a God guiding it all.
No doubt, another resource is required.
And this gives us a very useful insight into the psychology of the speaker in this video. He views human embryology as analogous to the baby pulling the train.
The emergence of a complex human from some simple water.
He views the emergence of something like a peacock as analogous to the baby pulling the train.
How can these atoms form a structure like a peacock despite lacking attributes such as knowledge, free will, power, and life?
In other words, he thinks that even though we've fully explained the sequence, by his own admission, even though we have fully explained the sequence of how a baby emerges or how a peacock comes from something as simple as an egg, despite the fact that that's fully explained, there still remains a mystery to his mind. The mystery of why anything is happening at all. And this, guys, is rather telling. You see, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, to quote a very old phrase. And of course, if you're a theist, everything looks like God was involved. Everything, because God created everything. And if God created everything, then everything is evidence for God. It's a tautology.
So everything we see tells about Allah, those who want to find Him.
If I explain fully and meticulously the nature of human embryology, or how peacocks can emerge from something as simple as a peacock egg, even after I've explained all of it, God must still be involved. God must be involved. He cannot conceive of a way that this could all function without a God. And in admitting that fact, he is admitting to his own incredulity and demonstrating that all he's articulating here is one big fat argument from ignorance fallacy. In short, his view is, I can't think of how this could work without a God, therefore God. And quite simply, folks, that isn't good enough. It's not going to cut it. It shouldn't convince any budding skeptic. And I hope that I did something to convince you that it's hogwash. But with all that said, I'm going to leave it there. What did you think of this atheist's answers to these allegedly unanswerable questions for atheists? Jump into the comments below and let me know your thoughts. And while you're at it, I'd love to hear your answers to these questions. Could you have done better than I did? Do you think I missed something? Could I have improved a particular criticism? Or what have you? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Other than that, guys, please consider dropping a like on the video. It helps out the channel enormously, and it will result in me giving you more videos like this one. If you're enjoying my content, liking a video helps out the channel greatly, and it leads to the success of the channel, which of course will lead to more content just like this. And while you're at it, subscribe if you want more. If you want to take your support of the channel a step further, jump into the description box below, and when you're there, you'll find the link to my Patreon. Click that and you'll be brought to a page where you can sign up for as little as £3 a month, and depending on which tier you choose, you will gain access to a plethora of perks, bonuses, and extras. And with all that said and out of the way, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.